Hello everyone. Today we'll be going over some brutal torture methods used throughout history. And if you're wondering where this bizarre idea came from, recently I went to this job interview after my last employment place closed down and I was looking for a job and heaven knows I'm miserable now. So anyways, I went to a job interview at Amazon and I was told to wait for my interview in this really cramped room with like 8 other people. And it was painfully quiet, and I thought to myself, wow, this sure is some torture. And that whole event basically inspired today's video. And very quickly, let's go over some torture methods that are most popular in media in real life. For our first torture method I'll be mentioning is the CIA's favorite torture method. And if you already know this, you probably guessed it, it's the waterboarding technique, which basically, in this position, the torturer would place a towel over the victim's face, and then afterwards they would continuously pour water on their head, eventually suffocating them nearly to death. And if you haven't noticed the shirt I'm wearing, it says, "I was an unwilling participant in MK Ultra ran by CIA." I'm not sponsored or anything, but I felt like this shirt was fitting for today's video. Now, if you're wondering when the CIA would use this technique, they would use it right after the attacks on September 11th, 2001. They would use it on 3 different detainees at the time. And for the next torture method I want to go over very quickly, it's the rat cage. Now, there are a lot of depictions of this method used in media, and there are a lot of variations of this method used in real life. For instance, there might be one variation where the cage is placed on the victim's head like this, whereas in another instance, there might be the cage placed on the victim's torso. However, in both of these instances, inside these cages, there would be placed hungry rats. And once the rats had grown hungry enough, they would basically tear through the victim's skin and eat the insides of the victim. Now, the first ever recording of this method ever being used was during the Dutch Revolt in the 16th and 17th century. Already from early times, the human mind is a really dark place and can create really terrible horrors. And the next torture method we have, let me read my script, is cock and ball torture. I probably shouldn't include that in today's video, but just know cock and ball torture does exist and it's very much somebody's fantasy rather than a torture method. And let's just move on to the main torture methods I want to go over today. And now for the next torture method I want to go a little more in depth is the Catherine wheel, otherwise known as the breaking wheel or the execution wheel. Now, this torture method was used all the way back in the medieval ages, all the way up until the 19th century. Now, this torture method was split into 2 different parts. And the first part, the torturer's main goal was to break the victim's limbs. He would do this either with a huge wheel from a carriage or a cart, or he would use a huge club. Depending on how severe the crime was, he would brutally beat the victim until all the limbs were broken. And once the limbs were broken, he would basically braid the victim's limbs into the spokes of a wheel. Now, if the victim wasn't already brutally beaten to death from the first part, and the second part, this wheel, now that it has a human braided into it, would be adjusted high on top of a mast or a pole where he would sit on for days on end. And now here are where several variations may come in. Once the victim was placed on top of a pole, below him the torturer might set a fire, and essentially the victim would be cooked alive for long periods of time. That is terrible. While in another variation before the second part, when the victim is in the wheel, the torturer might wheel him down a really steep hill. And if you want a visual example of this, there are enemies in the Dark Souls games that basically represent this. But why was this method also called the Catherine wheel? It was because of Saint Catherine of Alexandria, who was going to be executed by the Roman Empire for her religious beliefs in Christianity. Initially, she was going to be executed by the breaking wheel. However, when she came into contact with the breaking wheel, it magically broke. Now, there is no solid evidence of Catherine ever existing. Rather, it was part of the lore in Christianity. And for our next torture method, we have something possibly even more degrading and with more religious tones. That being the Judas cradle, which the whole entire goal of this torture device was to cause the victim the most sufferable pain to ever exist. Now, this torture device was basically a stool. However, where the seat should be at, there was this pyramid object, and the top part of this pyramid was so sharp that it could pierce through the victim's skin. The victim would basically be harnessed up into the air and be slowly lowered onto the top part of the pyramid. Basically, his anus area would enter the pyramid, causing him or her the most extreme pain I could hopefully never imagine. Now, the victim wouldn't instantly die from being placed on top of the Judas cradle, but depending on how severe his crimes were, he would be left on top of the Judas cradle for days on end. Now, there might be some variations of this torture method. For example, there might be weights attached to the victim's arms. Or another variation might include the torturer shaking the victim from left to right. Both of these variations would make the process even more fast. And for our next torture method, we have execution by elephants, which is really brutal, and as you can imagine, there are a lot of different variations to this method. For example, in 1814 in India, a slave had just recently murdered his slave master, and as a result for that action, he would be sentenced to execution by elephants. Now, in this instance of the execution, the victim's legs were tied to the elephant's foot. Now, keep in mind, the elephants used in this torture method were Asian elephants, and the adults could weigh anywhere from 8 tons to 10 tons. So now that the victim's legs were tied to the elephant's legs by a rope, imagine the victim being pulled by a force that weighed 10 tons. And this would happen for an hour, and within that hour, the victim's legs would be dislocated. Once the hour had passed, the executor would instruct the elephant to step on the back of the head of the victim. And oftentimes, the instructor, the torturer, or the executor would instruct the elephants to do things. That makes this whole entire torture method even more interesting, as there was this coexisting between the executor and the elephants. Oftentimes, the person instructing the elephant what to do in this execution would be people of royalty. For example, in Siam, before Thailand was called Thailand, there was kings who would use this torture method. They would instruct elephants to execute criminals by basically telling the elephants to thrash around the criminals for hours on end. This would mean just trampling over the victim or using the trunk to move the victim violently. And now, we'll take a little quick history lesson detour all the way back to 323 BC. Perdiccas, a Macedonian general, had just been put into power. After Alexander the Great's death, Perdiccas had subjected nearly 300 mutineers to be trampled by a stampede of elephants. This was just another example of execution by elephants, this time on a larger scale and possibly even more brutal than the last mentions I mentioned. And now, for the final variation of execution of elephants, this time it would be documented in Sri Lanka in 1681 by an English sailor who had witnessed this execution method firsthand. Here, he noticed that the tusks of the elephants were suited with basically large knives, and as you can imagine in this variation, the victim would basically bleed out from being thrashed around by the tusks of this elephant. Personally, I feel like this variation is really brutal, because at the time, seeing this elephant beast for the English sailor, it seemed like it would be a beast from fantasy. And now imagine this beast having knives which would basically cut the victim up in pieces and basically make the victim bleed out to death. And for our next torture method, we have something possibly even more complex than the previous torture methods I have mentioned. That being the blood eagle. And if you're wondering to yourself, what does the blood eagle look like? Well, it's just as brutal as it sounds. Essentially, the victim would have been lying on their chest, while the executor would pierce a sharp object through their victim's back, applying enough force to sever the ribs. And now that there is a massive open wound, the torturer would stretch out the ribs from behind to resemble what looks like wings from the ribs. And once the ribs were stretched over the victim's back, the executors would take the lungs out of the victim and basically wrap it over the ribs, making this whole blood eagle resemble even more of an eagle. And while there remains no concrete evidence of this torture method ever existing, there was 2 sagas written in ancient Norse that basically describe the events of the Blood Eagle, and I'll have to look over my notes in order to give you the full details of these sagas. There was actually a text known as the Orkneyinga saga, which was written in the late 12th century. After being translated from Old Norse, a section of the saga reads as, Einar made them carve an eagle on his back with a sword, and cut the ribs all from the backbone, and draw the lungs thereout, and gave him to Odin for the victory he had won. It was believed that the blood eagle method was used to provide Norse god Odin with a human sacrifice, as is evident within the first text. This incident had supposedly happened in north of Scotland, and I know I butcher the names of those Norse names as I do not speak Norse, and I apologize for that. There is also another saga known as Heimskringla, which is a collection of sagas about Swedish and Norwegian royalty written presumably in the 13th century, and in the Heimskringla saga, it recounts the same events as previously mentioned, but in a different perspective. In this part reads as, afterwards Earl Einar went up to Halfdan and cut the blood eagle on his back, in this fashion that he thrust his sword into his chest by the backbone, and severed all the ribs down to the loins, and then pulled out the lungs, and that was Halfdan's death. In the fashion of this brutal torture method, it seems like it was just purely to send a message to their enemies, to make them fear them, or it was just a sacrifice to their Norse god Odin. And whatever enemies came across the remains of the blood eagle, I'm sure they were greeted with pure horror as they saw their fallen comrade now strung up to resemble a really grotesque eagle. The blood eagle torture method is also depicted in media. There's a film known as Midsummer, which is personally one of my favorite films, and you should really check it out if you haven't. It's brutal, and it beautifully encapsulates the blood eagle. There's a character known as Simon who wants to run away from the commune, and when he attempts to do so, he's stopped by the villagers or the cult members, whatever you want to call them, and when he's shown again in the film, it looks like he had the blood eagle ritual done on him. Additionally, in the series Vikings, which was on the History Channel, I believe, they show a depiction of the blood eagle. And as well in the show Hannibal, the protagonist and a side character enter this room where they see a couple who had the blood ritual done on them. And for our final torture method of the day, we have something possibly even more disturbing than all of the rest I have previously mentioned. It involves a boat in a really disturbing yet creative way, that being scaphism. And for this method and to go over the history of it, I'll have to look at my notes. The first record of scaphism torture method happening had been reported by Greek philosopher Plutarch, written in 75 BC in his work Life of Artaxerxes, which was historical commentary on the king of Persia at the time, Artaxerxes II. And in this work of Plutarch's, he documented the first ever execution by scaphism. And in Plutarch's recounting of events, a soldier known as Mithridates had accidentally murdered Cyrus the Younger, Artaxerxes II's younger brother, while in the Battle of Canuxa. And for the punishment, Mithridates would be executed by scaphism. There would also be another recounting of events of the same situation regarding Mithridates' death. This time it was written by 12th century Byzantine chronicler Joannes Zonaras, based on Plutarch's work previously mentioned. The word scaphism has its roots in ancient Greek, where scaph means in hollow. Essentially, scaphism does involve hollowed objects, those two being hollowed out boats, which would be described further in a few moments. I'll use both description of Mithridates' execution from Plutarch and Zonaras to give you a fully in-depth look into what exactly is scaphism. Essentially, two boats are framed together, one on top and one on the bottom, and there would be several holes cut into the now one boat, exposing Mithridates' heads, arms, and feet to outside elements. Think of it like this. Basically, the boat was made into this really brutal coffin, which would include defecation. And why defecation, you may be asking yourself? Well, I'm glad you asked, because I'll be explaining that just in a second. Mithridates was placed on his back, and then the two boats would be nailed shut. And then Mithridates would be constantly fed a mixture of milk and honey until he became nauseous. And as well, the torturers would continuously pour over this mixture over Mithridates' body, his legs, arms, and head. This was all happening while this coffin of a boat was floating over a small body of water. And to add even more agonizing pain to Mithrates' suffering at the time, he was facing the hot sun, leaving him to be sunburnt during his time of torture. Mithrates was left on this death boat for 17 days. But wait, this torture method gets even more brutal. As a mixture of milk and honey was poured over Mithrates' body, it would soon attract insects such as wasps, bees, and flies. The bees and the wasps would sting Mithrates, and the flies would essentially eat Mithrates alive. And after being fed this mixture, Mithrates would soon suffer from diarrhea, and something even more degrading would happen. As written by Plutarch, creeping things and vermin spring out of the corruption and rottenness of excrement, and eventually maggots would eat the inside of Mithrates. Basically, Mithrates was left to suffer on this boat for 17 days, before ultimately passing away from stings, being eaten alive by flies and larvae. It is quite disgusting, and was in a constant cycle of suffering. However, there is a bright side to this torture method. That being, this is the only one instance and recording of this torture method ever being practiced on a human being, which I'm quite thankful for. So today, we took a little deep dive into the dark side of human nature and its violence. We went over things such as the Judas cradle, which involves something really disturbing with the anus area of a victim, to something as simple as execution by elephants. Whatever torture method there is, I can't possibly picture myself ever being tortured by any of these methods that are described. If you watched this whole entire video, I'm thankful for that. Please make sure to like and subscribe, as I'll be making more related content to things morbid. And I do have a video that's going to come out in a month or so, which basically goes over Silent Hill's representation of monsters and what exactly does Silent Hill mean to the player and its main characters. This has been Stalkeen, and I'll see you all later.